Jess, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've been trying to make this recording for a long time, and it's very interesting that Stuart Watson, I think, was the one who introduced us, and
Yeah, like
you
two
told
years
me
ago.
at the time that you wanted a bit more time to have a bit more experience. But here we are, finally doing the recording. So thank you for coming on the podcast with me.
2 years later, potentially have matured and grown a point of view at this point. Thanks
Right.
for having me on.
Well, I'm excited to hear it. I mean, the in the pre-call we were talking about, what do we want to talk about? What do we, what can we add to this conversation around branding? And you had a very interesting take on diversity, but not in the kind of holier than thou lectury kind of way. Can you
Oh
talk a
God, no.
little bit around how you believe kind of unfiltering yourself and creating openness creates value for design and for brands and for companies?
I mean, yeah, so this goes far beyond just diversity and being like a minority voice, right? Just a bit of background for people who are listening. I am an Indonesian Chinese woman who grew up in Australia, studied in Australia, and moved over to London to pursue design and branding. And I've gone on quite a journey, I think, from like coming from an industry where it was just only white men, but also very specific kinds of, I would say, like personalities and characters. The loudest voice wins, the most assured voice wins. Um, Very kind of like dominant spaces, and had to kind of like go through that and like find my voice, find my point of view. I think even the fact that I recoiled at the first point when Stuart kind of like suggested I speak to you is very much so like a relatable thing for like many of your listeners who might not be white men.
So it's interesting for me because one of the challenges that I gave myself when recording this is, obviously it's easy to go after the greats, the people who are already famous, the people who are already established, the people who've already kind of built a name and had a kind of a conversation. But I think in the world we live in now, we don't live in a top down sort of dichotomy anymore. It's much more kind of widespread, and brands and companies and ideas are sort of coming out of places that they didn't necessarily have the potential to do, a few years ago. And I think as people working in this formal industry of creating brands, like how do we then, embrace this new way, this new idea, these new companies that are coming up from founders that don't necessarily look like the founders that came
Yeah.
before, and coming from countries and locations and ideas and from perspectives that we haven't necessarily had.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly useful, like seeing how, um, like, yeah, the founders are no longer just the ones that you've always known and always seen. Like, if you watch an episode of Dragon's Den, you're finding so many more like um, ethnicities, and you're finding so many more walks of life and genders kind of like entering the space and becoming entrepreneurs, being the ones who are reaching out to branding agencies and needing their help. And you're going to need like a whole bunch of different people to also like get into the minds of all clients. And I think if I were to kind of like talk about, your initial question, right? Like this whole idea of what happens when you've kind of like gone past the initial conversation of like, okay, we need more diversity in branding. What happens when you start hiring people who are from diverse backgrounds? That's not, you're not going to unlock um, like the good stuff essentially from diversity if you just leave it at that. Because remember, like, I think if I were to speak on my own experiences, and I can't speak for all minority groups or like whatever, but I think like after like talking and having really frank conversations with people who are in the same position as me, I have realized a lot of um, kind of like recurring trends.
Mm.
As an Asian woman, you're socialized or like you're raised sort of to observe the boundaries a lot. You're really taught to like read the room, and this is stuff that is implicit. It's never kind of like spelt out to you, but you kind of are able to go into a room and in a way figure out like, where is it safe for me to kind of reside? Where is everyone looking? Who is everyone looking at? who is the one who thinks they have the power versus the person who actually does. And it's like actually kind of gross when you say it out loud and when you speak about it. But it's almost this like invisible world that you can
Mm,
perceive, right? And because of that, you sort of don't really learn to develop your own thoughts, at least from my in my experience. I didn't learn to develop my own perspective, but I learned how to read the room and how to like adjust myself to exist within it, how to make
mm,
people feel good, how to understand what's that person's kind of like underlying motivator or driver,
hmm.
and how can I be the one to help fulfill that or like get things in place so that that can unlock for them, right?
When you talk about it like that, it sounds like a superpower. It sounds like something that can be quite valuable if harnessed, if sort of directed
Yeah.
effectively, because you're able to understand what's happening on a different level and then able to adjust and sort of communicate in a slightly different way to suit the scenario that you're in.
Ross, it's so useful. I would say that like it's a weakness in some ways, but also it's a strength. It's a
Mm,
weakness when you dilute yourself to the point of invisibility, where you don't exist unless in relation to other people.
hmm.
Um, but it's also a strength when you actually overcome that. You kind of like get a sense of who you are, where you start, where you end, and then you're able to still have those skills of like just deep, deep empathy, deep understanding of what people's motivators are, and bring those two together. That's where I think the
Mm,
magic really happens. And that's where I think
mm.
over the last 2 years since we first talked, that was the journey that I was on. And so it's really fresh. And I'm excited to talk to you about that.
That's super cool. I mean, the way you framed it to me, which I wrote down and then underlined, was this thing of weird ideas. I love that as an I like as a concept. Like, what do you think about weird ideas, and how's that potentially valuable for companies, for people who are building brands, for people who are sort of looking to leverage something new and interesting?
Well, first we need to define what a weird idea is, right? Because I think it's easy to think when you hear a weird idea, it's like weird for weird sake. And that's definitely not the case. I would actually define weird ideas as really, really normal ideas in real life that are filtered out once it gets into corporate land, essentially.
Mm,
So I think things that are most immediately human, most immediately endearing, charming, you kind of laugh at, and kind of create visceral reactions inside of you. You find that a lot actually in meme culture. You find that in TikTok a lot. Like that's where it's all concentrated.
mm,
Um, those are the normal ideas, I would say. I'm speaking with air ponies, air quotes. But once you kind of put them into a brand where it's no longer an individual human speaking and it's more of a corporation, it's an engine to kind of create more wealth or something like that, then it starts to become weird in that context. Does that make sense?
mm. Yeah. It's not that the idea is weird, it's the context and how it's applied is what makes it feel weird. The way I sort of always describe weird is just sort of different from what you've seen before. So
Yeah.
if you live in Johannesburg and you fly to New York City, you're going to see a whole bunch of things that to you are weird.
Yeah.
But for if you take that New York person and drop them in Joburg, they would have a very different experience, and they'd be looking at stuff and going, "That's weird," and you're like, "Oh, but that's just how
It's
we do
literally
it
just
here.
context.
That's normal
Yeah.
to me. It's regular."
Yeah, like I don't know if you've seen these like bits of content online where it's like people kind of like me existing from my 5 to 9 and then like me kind of like putting on my meat suit to then like get into work and then exist in that space. Or it's sort of
Mm.
like Severance. Have you seen Severance?
No.
Oh, you'll have to watch it. But essentially, it's this show where it's like people, normal people, kind of like going to work, and then the moment they enter their building and they go up the escalators, something happens to their consciousness where they become a corporate version of themselves, right? And so that's essentially what I mean. Like, a lot of the times brands are like not talking like normal people, and not. I don't think they always should be talking like normal people, or like I don't think all brands need to have the weird ideas that we see online, or like
Mm.
the normal ideas that we see online that become weird in their context. But I think what happens is we filter out really good ideas that would actually work for brands and businesses. But there is someone in the room that gets nervous because they haven't seen it before in
Mm.
the context of their brand or the corporate sphere, say. And they go, that would never work. Let's go a different route. Let's do what Meta's doing. Let's do what Target's doing, or like Walmart or something like that. And then things start to become homogenized and really narrow.
Mm.
It's such a skill to be able to like unfilter those thoughts out of your mind as a designer when you are designing. It's so easy to think of like the five themes that you know that if you make that concept the theme of connection, if you make the concept the theme of networking or something like that, you know that it's going to feel safe enough, that it will be buyable enough. There's
Mm.
a skill to like override that a little bit, find what's unique about that company, and kind of like it's probably just like hiding in plain sight and then exploding that out and making that the most obvious thing that will cut through because it is so obviously normal that it's weird.
Yes.
I
I mean, I
think
love
it
that. So
like, yeah.
how would you, so I guess you're saying that this thing's going to feel, when you see it for the first time in the context that you're sitting in, it's going to feel uncomfortable or not, not safe, not normal. And I think a lot of
Yeah.
people in a work context operate from a safety, like I want this to work, the stakes are high, like need it to kind of work. How would you encourage businesses or people who own brands to sort of look at these ideas that might feel weird and give them space to either succeed or fail, so actually go, cool, let's test this thing out and see how far it can go, and then look at whether it actually does what it purports to do or not.
Well, I think it's a lot to ask a client to be brave like that, right? I think a lot of it comes down to the agency, to the studio, to the designers and strategists and writers who are working on that project.
Mm.
First, it starts like the onus is on us, I would say, really, to take a beat, really understand um, who the client is as a business, people who are within the room on the project, on the client side, but also even trying to get to know people beyond that, like who's going to be taking care of this brand once you're done designing. What are their day to days like? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Sometimes a
Mm.
little bit of Instagram, a LinkedIn, a TikTok stalk is great in understanding kind of like the wider makeup of the client, and it's something that I'm
Yes.
definitely not against. um, but also like just really understanding the clients from like a interpersonal level, and like there are some quiet people, figure out how they like to speak, if they're more DMers, if they're more slackers, get on Slack with them and like talk to them. If there are some people who are a little bit more IRL or like Zoom esque face to face people, get to know them. And like once you kind of like get to know the cadence of their personality, what really like sparks them, what they find interesting, what they're scared of, then that's when you can start building a story, right? And
Mm.
story is so important, right? Because we're not rational beings that remember facts and figures, although there are plenty of minds that do that. But if you really want to convince someone, you really need to tell them a compelling story. You need to put them at ease first. And so that starts off with the understanding them. Tell them the thing that's going to like drop their shoulders, and they're going to feel like, ah, okay, great. These guys get it. So you're opening
Mm.
up their hearts, right? And then bit by bit, introduce to them the big idea. That's
Mm.
probably a normal idea hidden in plain sight. If you can get them to have that moment where they're like, oh my God, why did we never think of this? Then you've absolutely won. That's rare, I would say.
Mm.
Aim for that, but also it's okay if you don't get there. Tell them the big idea and then just start kind of building a world. Like, show them things that express the idea tonally through voice. Get them to have like a moment of like an aha moment. Show it in digital, show it on their product, show it on some of their day-to-day apps, make it feel real. And by the end of it, get them like they have to be smiling. Like God help you if they're not smiling throughout the process. There has to be joy in the story, because otherwise people are just going to be so guarded and shut down. So I
Mm,
think it takes a lot on them already to even say yes to a rebrand. You're essentially asking them to like change their day to day, once that rebrand hits. So like that bravery is there, it's done. And we need to kind of just make sure we're holding their hand through that whole entire process by really understanding them and then telling a story that is compelling and makes them smile.
mm. I mean, I love that because what you're saying there is that the responsibility for the weird idea sits with the people who kind of created it or have unearthed it,
Yeah.
and you can convince people of it. And I guess what I took out of that whole thing is it's actually just about making the weird idea not weird. It's just showing them the lines that sort of connect it all together. Because if they can see it, then it means that their customers, will also see it. They will also like see it and experience it. And then what's interesting is they'll also realize that it wasn't as weird, and now they'll feel different to the other people. I mean, look at
Yeah.
things like the Old Spice campaign from years
Yeah.
ago. It was so off the wall, but it said so much about the company and the brand, like, and
Yeah. It
it sort of
really cut through.
birthed a generation of advertising. Now there's a million kind of copycat brands, but there was that first step that somebody convinced somebody to take. And I
Yeah.
think it only happened because that brand was on its last legs and they were kind of like, well, we're probably just going to shut it down,
We have
so if
nothing
you
to
want to do
lose.
something weird with it, so yeah, it kind of makes sense. But it's now birth. Now if you do that kind of advertising, it doesn't feel strange. It's just, oh, they're doing that irreverent
Yeah.
old spicy thing. But they've tapped into that like human thing that other people can look at and go, oh, I get it. Like, I get it, because essentially you're
Exactly.
selling body wash that smells like your grandpa. It's not, like, it's not a big deal. It's a silly thing that
Anyone
you're
else could have
purchasing
done
in the
it,
big.
right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like anyone else could have done it. The product was not inherently any different.
Mm.
But they built this like tone that was just like so reverent and so weird, and like didn't get it. And everyone else was trying to speak to reason, and they spoke to
Mm.
irrationality, and made you.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and I
yeah.
love that stuff. And sometimes, I mean, you said like they're speaking irrational, but I think, what I find interesting in the way you described it, it can also be speaking to, like a truth that isn't mainstream. So it could be like, we're seeing it more and more, brands that are designed kind of by women for women, and there's like a line in there that most men don't understand, but when a woman hears it, they're like, 1,000% understand what you're saying, and I'm
Yeah.
with you wholeheartedly. And I guess in the time we live now, there's opportunity for like brands to be built for like small subsects of humanity, which means the appeal doesn't have to be, this wide like thing. You can be like super generic, like super specific to a super like tight knit audience, which means your quality of communication, your nuance, your all of these things can sort of be on a level that you would never be able to unlock if you were attempting to speak to every human in the world simultaneously.
I mean, like a brand that springs to mind is like Liquid Death, which is like, they're a water company. Like they sell, instead of selling bottled water, they sell canned water. And there's literally
Mm,
nothing different about their water. I mean, like some of it's flavored, I guess. So like they have a library of like mango, strawberry kind of like based water. But again, like other brands are doing that. And essentially they've built their whole entire brand off this one idea of murdering your thirst, right?
yeah.
And they could have picked any other word. It didn't have to be murder. It could have been quenched or whatever, right? But they went
Mm,
hardcore with it. And it's like the can itself, the package looks like a death metal band.
mm,
They have, imagery of like coffins. They have actors like the cast of The Boys, right? Like it's really irreverent, kind of like superhero movie, that is quite gory, has a lot of murder, grotesque scenes, basically getting people from that into their campaigns and making it just like look so bonkers. I think their mascot is like a really, like, think of Terry Crews, but like instead of a man's head, it's like a thumb with an eye that's like bleeding. It's like actually terrifying. But I can't think of any other water company really after I've seen Liquid Death, because Liquid Death just did something I never thought was possible, right? They made
Yes.
this mundane water company into like this world that almost made it makes Old Spice look safe.
Yes.
But
Well, I
they
guess it's
basically, yeah,
I guess this is coming back to a conversation you're having, like diversity, diversity because it's mandated or because it's the right thing to do is a necessary thing, but it's not going to be lovingly embraced. Whereas diversity, because it allows us to be a completely standout company,
yeah,
tap into ideas and things and opportunities, and communicate in a way that feels completely unique, completely fresh, completely in line with who we are. This
yeah.
now becomes that superpower. It becomes that thing where you're like, now if we can do that, like, why wouldn't we embrace this idea? Why wouldn't we kind of go after it? Because it makes perfect sense.
Probably like such a different mind, different set of minds who actually came up with that idea, but then were able to lean into that unfilteredness and like make Liquid Death a reality. And again, it's one of those brands. If you're creating for a niche, if you're creating for like really specific people, you are going
Mm,
to put yourself a little bit at risk of like being hated, right? And I think a lot of people hated Liquid Death, but on
mm,
the flip side of that, you get a lot of people who love Liquid Death, and that's the reason why you want to go for a niche, right?
totally. I mean, I love one of our previous guests is Freddie Ost, and he says that if you want fans, you got to make enemies. Like you
Oh
can't
yeah,
you can't
absolutely.
have you got to have both. And I do think that there's something special in that for companies who are willing to sort of draw a very specific line and speak to a very specific audience and do so in a unique way,
Yeah,
because it does allow them to do that. I mean, Liquid Death is becoming a mainstream brand now. It's on the shelves at Walmart. Like it's broken. It used that niche to establish its sort of beachhead, and now kind of the consciousness expands, and we're able to now accept that a water could have a skull on it and it's in a can. And I've seen it around a bit, and now you've got moms in Nebraska buying it off a shelf in Walmart. Like it's become, it's like it's kind of come full circle
normal
into
now.
that sort of space. So how do you, I mean, you now managing people, you running a team, like how do you nurture these ideas out of people so that they can be kind of put into a story and then put in front of a client? Like, how do you think about that piece of your work?
I think a lot of it starts beyond even getting into a client project, and it's like a day-to-day thing, right? Um, I work with an incredibly diverse set of people at Ragged Edge. It's something that we have really focused our attention on when it comes to hiring, not only through diversity of like gender and race, but also like of mind and like the way people work and the way people communicate, right? So really focusing on kind of like building a design space that allows people to not only be different, but to also belong in that difference. And so I think, initially we would have quite open conversations about like our home lives, what it was like growing up, being basically not white essentially, and just being really open about it around the lunch table. And some designers would come up to me afterwards asking like, oh my god, did I cross the line just because I was like really truthful about my experiences? It's insane that you really double think yourself, and you kind of like think that talking about race and talking about difference, talking about gender can be like a really dirty and exclusionary thing. I think the first thing is really just kind of like taking a beat and being like, just be yourself.
Mm,
You don't have to filter yourself. Obviously, be kind and like, have tact. But I'm talking about just really normal, mundane details about your personal life that come from your culture and being different. absolutely say those things. So it starts there, giving people the confidence just to be themselves, right? And then like you kind of need to also make sure that you're allowing people who are like quieter to really just like have the time to actually speak in a meeting. So it's really just by, watching who's about to say something, who's trying to say something, and kind of maybe making space for that, or like circling back to it if it was, the conversation moved too fast. And it always does, right? Making space for those people intentionally is something that we try to do. Our directors at Ragged Edge and like me, I definitely always wanted that to be the thing. Also, like work times, we have like flexible work times at Racket Edge. And so it's kind of like this level of trust that like we know that you're just going to get the work that you need to get done, because like ultimately we're a team and everyone counts on each other. But if your like life and all that stuff that happens in your life, really doesn't allow you for that, then like there are ways to kind of like work around that. I would
Mm,
say discovering things like when people are most productive, like chronotypes, that's been a really interesting unlock, I would say. There are some people who love the mornings and that's when they think the best. And so by allowing them just to like go off and like do their thinking then and like keep that all clear, that's been something that I think has been really useful. I personally am like a wolf, that's what they call it, in the chronotype kind of like circle. And I kind of understood that in myself, I actually work best and I think best after like 12. So like this is why we're talking at like 4 p.m. And so just allowing for like diversity of like thought, diversity of energy levels, diversity of like backgrounds, to not only be unfiltered but also be listened to, and kind of like making sure that work kind of works towards that and allows for that.
mm. It's interesting as you were talking. I was thinking also, if, what's quite interesting here is that a lot of the people that these companies are trying to appeal to, that these brands are trying to appeal to, are also these people. But the world's full of images of Ryan Reynolds, and I mean I love Ryan Reynolds, but he's like
Mhm.
loud and like precocious and out there, and there's a whole nother sort of set of human beings that are out there too. So I think it is interesting to say that if we give the space to people to express this, you can unlock interesting things. I mean, one of the stories that my wife Leanne told me around, when they sent the first female astronaut to space. These are some of the smartest people on Earth. They're building rockets and shooting people into orbit. And the engineers at NASA were so afraid to ask the astronaut about her
The tampon
cycle that
story.
they sent her to space with. She was there in space for 24 hours. They sent her up with 100 tampons, just
Yeah.
in case. We don't know what's going to happen, but he has 100 tampons, like just in case. So, like, if she was, riddled with bullets, she would have been able to sort of staunch the bleeding with the kind of level
One
of
bullet per,
of
yeah,
tampon
one
that they
tampon
sent
per
her up
bullet.
with. But it's interesting, by unlocking this extra layer of productivity and ideation and thought, you also now have the ability to speak directly to a group of people who might not have been directly communicated to by a brand in a public setting before, so which in itself is an interesting differentiator, like speaking directly to a market using a platform that's not traditionally used for it is also a fairly radical act in terms of like differentiation and standing out.
Oh, truly. Like, I am just waiting for the day that I get to, work in a brand that is for Asian women who live in the UK. Like, I don't know, like something that niche. There's a lot of us. Um, that would be insane.
Just shout out to all the founders out there. Jess
It's
is
time.
available.
It's time. I mean, I think I can give you like this isn't specifically like agency working for a business, but this is us hiring. And we were on the lookout for a designer, And there was one designer that came in, and they are Asian Australian, right? And so in the UK currently, right? And so for me, I walked in there being like a surprised, shocked. I was like, oh my goodness, you're from Australia. But the project that they showed me was for the Chinese Australian museum in like Sydney, basically, just a space to capture that, the history that we have that has never really appeared in like many like museums over in Australia, but just all in one place. And I got to tell you, like, it was like the first time that I think it's the first and last time so far that I have cried in a actual interview, and it was such a no-brainer because of just like the level of specificity in which they wrote their comms. I think there was a manifesto, and it was just speaking directly to the model minority. I think there was a line being like um, something about like, you don't see me, but I've been here the whole time, and that
Mm,
spoke to like my soul like directly, because I think I grew up feeling really invisible in a space, that really just didn't look like me. So immediately that was like crazy. And obviously, a lot of people probably feel that way, not only just Asian women, right? But then, like, the examples that they kind of mentioned about dinner, and like what even like the spaces that they actually recorded this manifesto in, like being the back of like a Chinese restaurant with like a family. It just, all of it was so specific that I had never seen that
mm,
before. It struck me, and I think I would love to see that sort of level of specificity in like more commercial brands,
mm,
because I do think that you're just going to like, our hearts are so ready for that. There is something that, there's a yearning there to like see yourself represented, that just like makes you really stop
mm.
and like want to
Well, I
spend.
think
Yeah.
it's, I think what you're expressing is that this is the ultimate, thing for a brand, is when someone feel like they emotionally feel connected to, like they see
Yeah.
your ad, your thing, and they're like, that's for me. That's like
I've
a
never,
deep,
yeah, yeah.
it's
But
like
like,
deep,
especially
and
when
like
it's
you
like
connect to it.
you really connect to it when you see that that's for me, but also it's compounded when you see that's for me, and I've never seen that before.
Mm,
When you see that, I've never seen something speak to me specifically before.
yeah.
There's like a wound there that is ready to be healed by your ad, your brand.
And if at that moment he presented you with a credit card machine, and something that you could have purchased, you would have been swiping with a
100%. I
smile
would
on
have
your
been
face.
swiping.
Yeah. But I
Yeah,
think this is,
absolutely.
this is the thing. It's these brands have their vehicles for emotion. They can do this, and I think we live in a time where technology has also allowed us to to show up differently in different places. So the technological platform exists for brands to speak specifically to audience. Like you don't
Yeah,
have to be a monolith anymore. Like the
no,
technology exists to sort of personalize and customize accordingly, and to inject yourself organically into the right sorts of places. I guess it
yeah,
all comes back to the desire. Do the companies see the opportunity? Do they see the piece? And I guess we'll probably see smaller companies do it first,
yeah.
because it's much easier for a small company to take a massive risk than it is for a big company to take a massive risk. And then what'll happen is the big companies will probably just copy. They're like, oh, this works, like we can kind of do it. Like, let's all kind of jump on that bandwagon. But it is, it is that piece. There's I don't know, brands that sometimes just land in the right spot at the right time, and you sort of remember it forever. For me, it's Stussy. Like,
Stussy, tell
I
me more about
wanted that. I wanted that brand when I was a teenager. It was like one of the coolest dudes in my school had one of those shirts, and I
that.
was like, he embodies everything that I appear. Like what I want in my life is I want this thing. And I went to a school, and a lot of the kids around me had a lot more money than I did, so they had these like clothing, and I wanted that shirt like
Oh
so
my
bad,
goodness.
and I saved up for it, and I eventually bought it. And you know, when you wear something so long, the collar starts to fray, it like comes apart where the fabric folds. I wore that shirt to death. Like, and I love that brand. And now I see it sort of coming back, and I get like nostalgia when I see these sort of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds wandering around
Yeah,
with the shirt on from my youth. I get this like nostalgia pang. That's a it's a
that's huge.
visceral human emotion I'm feeling towards a like a corporate item, which is like a irrational sort of thing. But exactly like you said, this is how we operate. We don't actually operate kind of rationally.
I mean, for that to kind of like make you feel a certain way, like that is gold. I think for me, my own kind of personal experience with that is travel lodge hotels, right? So like I feel like it's not a kind of sexy place for, you know, a young millennial woman to be like hanging out for her holidays, right? You get 20 or so days a year to like kind of like spend it. You kind of want to go to a really unique Airbnb in the south coast of like Spain or like whatever. But I think for me, traveling within the UK and then finding myself a dingy little travel lodge that has like an espresso machine and those like milk sachets, that's like optimal holiday for me. And I really had to like try and unpick like why is it that I love those places, and why do I spend all my money there? And there is something that brings me back to my childhood, and it brings me back to like growing up, kind of like poor with my family and not really having many holidays, and having this like once you go on a holiday you kind of stay at like a dingy little travel lodge-esque type place with like
Mm.
fluorescent lighting that like, you know, and flies. That has really like stayed with me and makes me feel like I'm back home again no matter where I am, right? Despite like getting away, that's the whole nature of a holiday. But yeah, it's like that visceral feeling, and that's why like travel lodge will always have my spend dollar.
That's amazing. So I mean, I'd like to just sort of, you know, I guess where we've come to is this idea that there's potential to design around something specific,
Yeah.
you know, instead of something generic. You know, I guess that's a sort of loop of the whole conversation, is like, how do we get sort of specific? Like, if Travel Lodge was to rebrand around that feeling that you just shared, you know, would it be more effective for them than saying like, you know, we're a budget hotel, you know, which is a fairly generic sort of statement to make out the world? How can they kind of capture a little bit about
Yeah.
that?
And it starts with them finding that insight. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, they need to understand that before they can design around it. But can you talk about how you try and do this in your work?
I would say that, you know, let's just take the example for Travelodge, right? How would they ever get that insight in a million years, right? It kind of like probably is lurking from inside someone working at Travelodge or whatever. Basically, what I am trying to say, the way that I design with specificity in mind is being like deeply connected to my own self, I would say, and just kind of like um, not shooting down things that I like, despite things that I like being quite unfashionable or not corporate or like uncool. So there are a few concepts in there, and let me like unpack that a little bit. If I were to speak from like more of a personal branding experience to kind of illustrate my point, I would say omelette would be that. Omelette's like a pet industrial design company. They invent things for pet owners, and those pet owners don't only own dogs and cats, but they also own chickens. And a lot of the market is for chicken people, right?
Chicken people. I like that.
Chicken people. Pause.
Excellent.
And so there are lots of I think there's a lot of imagery when it comes to people who own chicken in that come into your mind. Like it's just like it's preconceived ideas, right? It's like old MacDonald farmer, Guys with plaid shirts and like pitchforks and overalls. But like that's not really who we're building for. And it's easy for designers to kind of like assume they know who the market is. A lot of the times we'll have like an audience kind of like, they're 55, they're from this place, and this is their name, and this is what they like. And you paint people with broad strokes, but actually like, and you make assumptions, visual assumptions that they won't like certain things. So with Omelette, we felt that maybe like, people who own chickens kind of are closer to like the farming industry, and the things that they would like are probably a little bit more like engineer based. They're a little bit more industrial design, like sound design,
Mm.
essentially, right? um, but like what we as like individuals at Ragged Edge kind of felt about like chickens and stuff were like that chickens were just so weird. They were so interesting, and you can't help but like laugh when you actually look at them, right? And that is something that like lives within yourself. You don't need a rocket scientist or like a market researcher to kind of like tell you that. You kind of just know that chickens are endearing on like a universal level. And
Mm.
so we decided to create a brand that really like encapsulated that feeling that comes from a chicken kind of like blinking its eyes, like wandering around a farm, wandering around a backyard, and try to like bring that into an illustration style that kind of moved in a sort of jerky kind of way that made you kind of like laugh and smile, kind of like all pets do, right? They really make you laugh and they make you smile. So instead of like creating a brand that would appeal to like our stereotypical view of like a farmer, a heavy duty farmer, we tried to appeal to just chicken people, chicken lovers, by creating or surfacing what we thought was the best part of a chicken. And then we did that over and over again for each animal. And so what happened was you had a pet industrial design brand that looked more like a children's cartoon. And I think that really won hearts. And I think a lot of people within the design community, within the pet community, look to Omelette and they can't help but smile. And yeah, that's how we did that.
And I love that because it echoes a project that we did a while ago for a scrap metal platform. And if you
Yeah.
think of scrap metal, it's not the most sort of, I don't know, loving or friendly space, but a lot of the people we met in that space were just, they were just people who found this as a job and kind of are now semi-passionate about it. And there's this idea that, there's always like the evil dog in the scrapyard, which is what sort of Pixar and Disney have
Ooh.
kind of framed in our heads, that there's, always this like mean dog. But we were like, well, let's create a friendly dog, that scrap people can identify with and love. And testament to how well it worked is when they go to conferences, people want the merch so bad. Like they want it. They come to the stand and they're like, can I get that hat? And they're like, we don't have hats. They're like, please, can I get the hat? Can I
Oh,
buy the hat? I want it, which means we've created something that that speaks to those human beings. And like you said,
yeah,
we didn't frame it in a way, like a preconceived way. We framed it slightly differently, and that made it infinitely more appealing. Now, if you want the hat because you like the logo, you're probably going to have a conversation about what is this thing, like tell me about what it is that you sort of do here. And now you've connected to them, and you now have an opportunity to talk about all the things that you actually want to talk about as a business. So it does
yeah,
actually work to sort of get people's attention and get them to feel something about it. Like you say, if you did a functional brand, they probably would have had a fairly functional relationship with the product. They're like, I'll use it because it's useful, but I'm not going to love it, and I'm not going to tell my friends about it, and I'm not going to be proud of it. I'll just use it.
I'm not gonna fight for a cap. Like I think for someone to actually really want a piece of merch that like says so much, right? Like you just can't
Mm,
like use merchandise as like a touch point to kind of like slap a logo on. You gotta like kind of think like, is this some like if someone, even though this is something we're probably going to give out for free for brand awareness, would this be something that someone would want to buy? Like that's kind of like a
mm,
hypothetical test that I like to run myself through when I am creating merchandise for a brand. Is this something that someone would even want to pay for? And I think that's
mm.
how you kind of like figure out it's worth designing or creating.
Definitely. Well, Jess, I want to ask you one more question. The one thing you said when we were on our pre-call is that sometimes you find yourself caring too much, um, and that you find that that's a little bit uncool. Can you talk about how you care too much and why you think that's important?
Yeah, I've been on such a journey with this, right? Because I think sometimes there's a lot of shame when it comes to just wanting to do the best that you know you can do. And I think a lot of designers are like this. There is that stereotypical perfectionist designer. And of course, you can be paralyzed by by caring too much, I guess. You can be absolutely paralyzed. You can really work yourself to the bone. But I think like we should get to a point where we basically treat all designers as like adults who are completely in charge of their own kind of like choices and decisions. And I think a lot of the times I cared way too much about a client and their brand, and I really wanted to make it work. And so I would kind of even use personal time or like time on weekends. This is such, I feel so like exposed saying this, but like sometimes like you just gotta see it through. So you kind of make it kind of like a moment at a cafe on a weekend, and you kind of like just go for it.
Mm,
Um, I think that has been like caring too much about something to the point where I love it has been my like superpower, and I'm not sure if it's going to be forever. But I do think that the world isn't kind of like boxed into these little kind of like spaces that we kind of like create for people to kind of like work in. I think when it comes to design, it really is something that I'm on a journey with. I'm trying to figure out how to balance my life with design. But at this very point in my life, I think there is just so much love that I have for design, and I care about it so much. And I do think that people who care a lot ultimately produce amazing things that people will love, because they can see that there is so much love and there is so much care that has gone into
mm,
it. And I think when it comes to brands, I think um, don't worry about looking like you're like effortlessly cool, I guess. Like just be the brand that cares the most, and the people and the brands that care the most are ultimately the ones that win because they have so much willpower and determination behind them.
mm. I love that. I think it's such a great note to end on. I also believe in the time we live now. There's so much throwaway content, so much throwaway design, so much, so much stuff that's so hollow and empty, that I do believe people resonate with stuff when they see something, a product, a brand, anything that somebody has poured time and energy and effort and love into. It really does feel different to
Yeah.
the thing that was just bought, like made online using a few tools for a few dollars and kind of chucked out into the world with no real sort of thought or energy or effort. I do believe
Yeah.
that's going to be a differentiator over time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of the brands that we've worked for at Ragged Edge are interesting in the sense that they're like B2Bs that maybe a lot of people wouldn't find like that sexy to design for, but because like it's been designed by a team that just loves creating and loves the details, sweats the words, um, it has become something that people can look to and feel impressed by, whether in the design community or out there in the world. So I think you should never underestimate the product that you're designing for or the client that you're designing for, and never underestimate the power of loving something too much.
I love that. Well, Jess, we are out of time. Thank you so much for finally coming on the podcast, and testament to you, we've gone over the time, which means we will have. Well, I enjoyed the conversation, which
Oh,
means I believe other people will. So, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I really appreciate all the work that you can do. And before you become jaded and cynical and stop caring, I look forward to seeing the brands that you create.
hopefully that will never happen. Thank you so much for having me, Ross, and really persisting.
Cool.